Hello, my name is Jim Comstock Galligan. I'm an attorney in New Orleans, Louisiana. I have devoted the past 37 years of my professional career to representing children, adolescents, and young adults with disabilities and their families in education issues involving the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which I will refer to in this presentation as IDEA, and also Section 504. Today I'm going to talk to you about a couple of services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, i.e. IDEA, that can be of real benefit to students with disabilities who have behavioral challenges. Those two issues are functional behavioral assessments, which I will refer to as FBAs, and behavior intervention plans, which I will refer to as BIPs. Now, I'm going to begin this presentation by talking about ways to obtain functional behavioral assessment under IDEA, and thereafter to secure a behavior intervention plan under IDEA. So what are ways that you can actually request and obtain a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior intervention plan under IDEA? I'm then going to talk about what are the essential or critical elements of a quality functional behavioral assessment, as well as a quality behavior intervention plans. You may not know or believe this, but having practiced in this area for 37 years and having been to at least 200 IEP meetings involving clients of mine who needed functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans, the vast majority of people in those meetings were unfamiliar with the essential critical elements of a functional behavioral assessment, as well as the critical essential elements of a quality behavior intervention plan. So if the vast majority of people that I have encountered are not familiar with these critical components of FBAs and BIPs, think how important it is for you as a parent or as an advocate or as both a parent/advocate to know these elements. Because oftentimes when you go into a room involving IEP meetings requesting an FBA or a behavior intervention plan, you're going to need to be able to talk in an informed and knowledgeable way about how to get that under the law. And then once there is agreement as to providing a functional behavioral assessment or behavior intervention plan, what the key elements are so you can ensure you get a quality functional behavioral assessment, which can then serve as the foundation for quality behavior intervention plans. So I consider these two areas, FBAs and BIPs, to be absolutely essential learning for parents and or /advocates. And I hope through this presentation to provide you with a pretty strong foundation in how to go forward in requesting and obtaining FBAs and BIPs, and how to go forward in achieving quality FBAs and BIPs. So let's begin. Functional behavioral assessments. When are they necessary under IDEA? This is never really talked about, but you can get a functional behavioral assessment as part of a student's initial evaluation and or reevaluation. And here's how. We know under Child Find, school districts are required to identify, locate, and evaluate all children suspected of being or having a disability. Districts are required to conduct an initial evaluation of such children to determine if the child has a disability and to determine the educational needs of the child. So if a child is suspected of having a disability, a district must conduct an initial evaluation to determine if the child, one, has a disability, and two, what are their educational needs. And then if a child is found to have a disability, they are entitled to a reevaluation at least every 3 years, or sooner if requested by a parent or teacher. So now, though that's the underlying requirements for an initial and or reevaluation. But here's what's never talked about, and that is that the Office of Special Education Programs under the United States Department of Education has said that a functional behavioral assessment, FBA, it's an evaluation, and it can be used to help determine if a child has a disability. Therefore, it can be a part of an initial evaluation, or if a child continues to be a child with a disability. So an FBA can be a part of a reevaluation as well. And there's a site here to a document produced by OSEP in 2009 that provides detailed explanations of what I'm going to cover here. OSEP has also said an FBA can be used to determine the educational needs of a child. Now remember, initial evaluation, look at the second bullet, is done to determine if a child has a disability and to determine the educational needs. So here OSEP is saying an FBA can be used to determine the educational needs of a child. So this is very important. If a child is suspected of having a behavior-related disability, or a student has been referred due to behavioral issues, an FBA should be conducted as part of the initial evaluation. It's rarely, if ever, done. But the reality is, you should request it if the student is suspected of having a behavior-related disability or is referred due to behavioral issues. We know in Louisiana, where I live, an FBA is required for students who are suspected of being emotionally disturbed. It's required. But regardless of whether a student is suspected of being emotionally disturbed, I have often requested an FBA for students who are being evaluated due to a suspected behavior-related disability or due to ongoing behavioral issues. So you can get an FBA as part of the initial evaluation under these circumstances. If a student is already IDEA eligible and has a behavior-related disability, emotional disturbance, ADHD, traumatic brain injury, student with Prader-Willi syndrome who has behavioral issues, or has ongoing behavioral issues, an FBA should be conducted as part of any reevaluation. Again, rarely if ever done. So if it's going to happen, you're going to have to request it using those circumstances in this slide as the basis for your request, as either part of an initial evaluation or a reevaluation. But you can obtain it right from the get-go even. Next, here is another way to obtain a functional behavioral assessment. Under IDEA, an IET team must consider the special factor of behavior in the case of a child whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, and in so doing must consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports, which is known as PBIS. Now, any kid whose behavior impedes that child's learning or that of others, that kid's IEP team must consider the special factor of behavior. And in considering it, must look at PBIS for that kid. Now, this is interesting. This is the kind of knowledge that is power. OSEP's PBIS.org website stresses that the appropriate way to consider and use PBIS under the special factor of behavior is by first conducting an FBA and then developing a behavior intervention plan with PBIS. So, any kid whose IEP has marked behavior as a special factor, in order for that IEP team to consider the use of PBIS, OSEP has said that the appropriate way to consider and use PBIS is first by conducting an FBA and then developing a behavior intervention plan with PBIS. So this is another route to obtaining a functional behavioral assessment for kids with behavioral challenges. Now, there are a lot of court cases dealing with consideration of the special factor of behavior. And here's what courts have said. When a student with a disability has ongoing problematic behaviors that impede or interfere with that kid or other kids' learning, a district must conduct an FBA and develop a behavior intervention plan, a BIP, with PBIS. That's important. Second, other courts have said when a student has worsening behaviors that result in repeated suspensions, obviously impeding and interfering with the kid's education, a district must conduct an FBA and develop a BIP with PBIS. Again, another case, when a student with a current FBA has worsening behaviors and a BIP that is not working, a district must revise the BIP and implement PBIS when the special factor of behavior has been checked. So you need to learn these three kinds of circumstances that give rise under the issue of the special factor of behavior, which is checked on kids' IEPs. When that is checked, these are the kinds of circumstances that give rise to a district having to do an FBA and develop a BIP with PBIS. So, what's the next approach? Third, what are the requirements under IDEA's IEP provisions? Is the requirement to review and revise IEPs for a student's lack of academic or behavioral progress? Not done very often, unless the district wants to move a kid to a more restrictive environment. Typically not done to provide additional services to keep a kid in his or her current environment. The times when I've seen it, it's been done to move a kid to a more restrictive environment. But that is not the point of this provision. IDEA's IEP provisions say that an IEP team must meet during the school year, not at the end of the school year, during the school year, to review and revise the student's IEP to address any lack of academic and/or, I stress, behavioral progress toward annual goals or in the general curriculum. And here's, you will see there the cite to the regulations. So if a kid's not making academic or behavioral progress, the IEP team is to meet and revise the student's IEP, not meet and move the kid to a more restrictive environment. Meet and revise the kid's IEP. So, examples include where this is necessary. A student has ongoing behavioral issues that result in failing grades at any semester grading period. If that happens to one of your sons or daughters, you should request an IEP meeting to review and revise your son or daughter's IEP. If a student is repeatedly suspended in school or out of school in any semester, you should request that the IEP committee meet to review and revise the student's IEP. And reviewing and revising, the point here is to add services, not just change placement. Add additional services, more related services time, PBIS, more importantly, an FBA, as part of the review and revision to get a functional behavioral assessment and then a behavior intervention plan. If the student has worsening behavioral issues, you should request an IEP team meeting to review and revise the student's IEP. And in doing so, in reviewing and revising, you should request an FBA and a BIP. Interestingly enough, the Louisiana Department of Education has said, in any of the above three examples, an IEP team must meet under the need to review and revise due to lack of progress, and needs to recommend an FBA and a BIP. So at least in Louisiana, the State Department is on record saying that this provision under the law, reviewing and revising IEPs due to lack of academic or behavioral progress, when the kinds of circumstances I've just covered arise, the IEP team needs to meet, they need to review the IEP, and they need to recommend an FBA and a BIP. So this is a third way to get a functional behavioral assessment. A fourth way. When a student has been out of school due to disciplinary infractions for more than 10 consecutive days, or due to a number of disciplinary infractions where a kid has been suspended repeatedly for more than 10 days, for more than a total of 10 days, the student is entitled to a manifestation determination review. In conducting a manifestation determination review, if it's done by the IEP team, if the student's behavior is related to his or her disability, is found to be related, a district must conduct an FBA, unless it already has conducted an FBA for the student. But I want to emphasize, if an MDR is conducted, and the behavior is found related to the student's disability, and the district says, okay, the behavior is related, but the kid has an FBA from 3 years ago. Any FBA that's more than a year old isn't obviously working. The kid's now been out of school either 10 consecutive days or has been suspended repeatedly for more than 10 total days. There's problems with that FBA if it's more than a year old. So, if it's more than a year old, you want them to redo it. The other thing you get is the district must develop and implement a BIP. If the student has a BIP, it must be reviewed and revised. So remember that. Whenever the behavior is related in an MDR determination, the student is entitled to an FBA. If they have one that's more than a year old, they're still entitled to an FBA in my view. You want a new one. They're also entitled to a behavior intervention plan. If they currently have one, it must be reviewed and revised. So this is a fourth way to get a functional behavioral assessment under IDEA. Now, this slide should say, when there is a manifestation determination review and the student's behavior is not related. I meant to correct this slide. I forgot. My apology. But you need to go in and correct this when the student's behavior is not related to his or her disability. In this instance, IDEA does not automatically require an FBA or BIP for the student. However, the law says that an FBA and BIP must still be provided if it is appropriate for a student, even if an MDR ruling as the behavior is not related. So you're not automatically entitled to it, but still, if it's appropriate, you can get it. So this seems to be common sense to me. If the student does not have an FBA or BIP, yet is having a manifestation determination review due to repeated suspensions, not one, but repeated suspensions, totaling more than 10 school days, behavioral interventions are obviously needed. They're obvious. The kid's been suspended repeatedly. Behavioral interventions are obviously needed, and thus a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior intervention plan are indeed appropriate. So, remember, even when an MDR is done, if you find that a student's behavior is not related, you can still get an FBA and a BIP if the student's MDR is a result of repeated suspensions. In that instance, the fact that there's all these ongoing suspension indicates the kid has a need for a functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan. So this is a fifth way to get an FBA and a BIP. Now, those are the 5 ways to obtain an FBA and BIP. Now let's start talking about what are the essential elements of an FBA and a BIP. I am moving in my chair, so if you all hear a little noise, just bear with me for 1 second. There, I'm situated again. Okay, here's what we know. Under IDEA, in the changes that were made in 2004, they added a peer-reviewed research requirement. You're not going to hear this talked about at IEP meetings. If you don't bring it up, you will not hear it talked about. I have yet to be to an IEP meeting since 2004, where the members of the IEP committee themselves brought up the issue of the services they're recommending. Are they peer-reviewed, research-based? So again, you're going to need to know what are the peer-reviewed, research-based elements of FBAs and BIPs. And you start with, what is a requirement of peer-reviewed research under IDEA? Here's what it says, and I give you the site. A student with a disabilities IEP, and thus IEP team, must include a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based upon peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable to be provided to the student. And here's what the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, has said about the phrase extent practicable. It generally means states, school district, and school personnel must select and use methods that research has shown to be effective to the extent that methods based upon peer-reviewed research are available. To the extent that methods are available. Well, trust me, in the area of FBA and BIPs, there's a lot of peer-reviewed research as to methods that work and are effective. So, there is, and I'm going to cover with you, what are the peer-reviewed research-based elements of FBAs and BIPs? They're out there. They exist, and thus, because they are available, and it's clearly they're practical as far as using, they must be used. Now, IDEA's peer-reviewed research requirement applies, as I just noted, to students' FBAs and BIPs. In fact, there have been several cases since 2004 that have found that students' behavior intervention plans, BIPs, were inconsistent with, contrary to, or without peer-reviewed research support. Numerous cases. Here's examples. One involved a BIP, behavior intervention plan, that included interventions that were inconsistent with and contrary to peer-reviewed research, and which in fact reinforced problematic behaviors. And this is important. One of the cases dealt with the repeated use of timeout for students with escape behaviors. If students are engaging in problematic behavior in order to escape, and you send them the timeout, guess what? You've given them what they're looking for. They're trying to escape. You've sent them the timeout and, in fact, enabled them to escape. So behavior intervention plans that use timeout for kids with escape-oriented behaviors are inconsistent with and contrary to peer-reviewed research. Second, there are still behavior plans out there that are based on point and level reward systems. These systems in behavior intervention plans have no peer-reviewed research basis for students with autism. I want to repeat that. Point and level reward systems in behavior intervention plans have no peer-reviewed research basis for students with autism. Nor do they have peer-reviewed research basis for students with intellectual disabilities. None. None. In fact, the peer-reviewed research that is out there says they do not work for students with autism, students with intellectual disabilities, students with traumatic brain injury. So, in this case, they used a point and level system with the kid with autism. It was not understood by the student with autism, and he was punished every time he did not follow his behavior intervention plan, a plan that had no peer-reviewed research basis. Third, behavior intervention plans which fail to include PBIS. Here's the thing about PBIS. It is peer-reviewed research-based. Just go to the Office of Special Education Programs, PBIS.org website. You will find pages and pages of peer-reviewed research, evidence-based articles to support PBIS. And yet lots of behavior intervention plans fail to include PBIS, which is peer-reviewed research-based. So remember, this peer-reviewed research-based practices apply to FBAs and BIPs. So now, before we talk about what are the peer-reviewed research elements for FBAs, let's talk about behavior generally. I think it's really important as parents and advocates, and oftentimes parents are serving in both roles, that we understand behavior in the broader context than just FBAs. So let's look at some of the universal truths about behavior. All behavior, be it a child's or an adult, serves a function or a purpose. And it serves one of three functions or purpose. It allows a student or an adult to get something desirable. It allows a student or an adult to escape or avoid something undesirable. Or it allows a student or an adult to communicate a message or need. So, we know there are three functions to behavior: to get something, escape or avoid something, or send a message. Now think about it. Everyone who's out there, take 20 seconds and think about, have you engaged in a behavior in the past week in order to get something? Think about what that behavior was. Okay. If we were in an audience, I would say, let's hear about name a behavior that you've engaged in to get something. Now take 20 seconds and think about, have you engaged in escape or avoidance behavior? I've engaged in that twice already today. Twice. It's not even noon, barely noon in New Orleans. But I've engaged in escape and avoidance behavior on 2 occasions already. Think about, have you done that in the past week? And then think about, have you used behavior to communicate a message or a need? Doesn't even have to be words. Have you used behavior to communicate a message or need? Sometimes, as we know, all it has to be is a look across the dining room table. You don't have to say a word. We know we've done these things. It's not only true for kids, it's true for us. Our behavior, we use behavior to get something, to escape and avoid things, and to also communicate messages. Students do exactly the same. These are universal truths about the functions of behavior. Another universal truth: all behavior occurs within a particular context. At school, it may occur in certain settings. Students' behavior may occur in a cafeteria. Let's say problematic behaviors of a kid may occur in certain settings, like a cafeteria, or maybe they only occur in the classroom, or maybe they occur only in common areas like hallways. They may occur under certain conditions, only during reading class. The kid's problematic behavior only occurs during reading class, or only when there is a substitute teacher. Now, we all know what it was like to have a substitute teacher. Think back upon when you were in school. Was your behavior the same when a substitute teacher showed up? No way. Did your behavior deteriorate when a substitute teacher showed up? 9 out of 10 times as kids, our behavior deteriorated when we had a substitute teacher. So, there's a context for behavior. It occurs under certain settings, certain conditions, or during different types of activities. Kids' behavior may occur only during recess, out on the playground. It may occur only during assemblies. So, we know all behavior serves a purpose. All behavior occurs within a certain context. The purpose of a functional behavioral assessment, then, is to look beyond a student's particular misbehavior, to look beyond whatever that behavior is, and to discover the underlying function or purpose of that behavior. Not just to look at the behavior and say, oh, that's bad, that's a problem, but to discover the underlying function or purpose of the behavior. What's known as the why of a student's behavior. Functional behavior examines a student's underlying motivation to get something, escape or avoid something, or communicate a message. What is the purpose? Is it to get something, escape or avoid something, or communicate a message? functional behavioral assessment examines which of these it is. It also examines the context of the problematic behavior. So, now we begin. It is critical as parents and advocates, oftentimes, as I've noted, parents serve in both roles, that you understand that you can get an FBA and it can be just awful. So getting an FBA under the 5 approaches that we talked about in the last half an hour does not assure you're going to get something of value. You just started, so now you've got them to agree under one of the approaches that we detailed previously to get it. They're going to provide your son or daughter an FBA. Now you have to make sure that you get a quality FBA. So here is the moment. You need to ensure that the way that FBA is conducted is going to be based upon peer-reviewed, research-based elements and criteria. And here's the first one. When an FBA is done, the first thing you want to do, and an FBA is done by the IEP team of which you are a member, the first thing you want to do is identify and define the student's target. This is the term schools will use with you, target. You're going to be thinking, what does that mean? That's the term they use for a student's problem behavior. So, the first thing, as peer-reviewed research-based, if you need to identify and define the student's target / problem behavior through concrete descriptions. Let me give you a couple examples. Historically, this is what you would hear. Trish is aggressive. Well, trust me, aggressive is in the eye of the beholder. What does aggressive mean? You can ask 5 people what aggressive behavior is, and you will get 5 different descriptions of it. So hearing that Trish is aggressive really tells you nothing. We want to define Trish's aggressive behavior in concrete terms. Do not allow it to be put down as aggressive. Here's how it can be defined concretely. Here's what Trish actually does. Trish hits other students on the playground. She's aggressive. Really, what does that mean? Nothing. Trish hits other students on the playground. Do we now know what she does? Yes. What is the problem behavior? Hitting other students. What is the context for that behavior? The playground. Next, Tristan. You'll hear it. You'll see this a lot. Tristan is disruptive. Once again, that's in the eye of the beholder. Very vague. Borderline meaningless as far as what it really means. So, the first thing you want to do as part of an FBA is define Tristan's behavior in concrete terms. So here we go. Tristan makes numerous irrelevant and loud comments during reading class. Now it's defined. What's his problem behavior? Numerous irrelevant and loud comments. What's the context? Class. What's the most detailed context? Reading class. Reading class. If Tristan's only making irrelevant and loud comments during reading class, we don't want it to be, we don't want to define the behavior in concrete terms, irrelevant and loud comments, numerous irrelevant and loud comments, and then not define the context by simply saying during class. During class would not be true. It's during reading class. So again, concrete description of the problem behavior, and also what this slide should say, a concrete description of the context. But that's coming up next. So, define the problem behavior, identify the context and settings in which the target behavior occurs. Where does so? We want to identify the setting under which the target, i.e. problem behavior, is most likely to occur, as well as the conditions and settings where the behavior, problem behavior, i.e. target behavior, does not occur. For Trish, where does her behavior occur? On the playground. Where does it not occur? There's no indication that her behavior or problematic behavior occurs in the classroom. What about Tristan? He's disruptive where? Well, disruptive doesn't mean anything, but he makes numerous irrelevant and loud comments where? In reading class. Oops, my apology. So the context for his behavior is the classroom, and in particular the reading classroom. It's not the playground, and it's not the hallways. It's important when we begin an FBA that we not only define the behavior in concrete terms, but we define the context or the setting of the behavior in concrete terms, and also where the behavior does not occur. For Trish, you don't want the functional behavioral assessment being conducted in the classroom. Where do you want the functional behavioral assessment to be conducted? Out on the playground. For Tristan, you don't want them going out talking to the playground monitors. His classroom behavior is occurring where? Disruptive, not disruptive, I apologize, but his loud and irrelevant comments are occurring where? In reading class. So you don't want the FBA to be conducted out on the playground or to be done with hall monitors or to be done with the teachers in his other classes. You want it to focus on where the problem behavior occurs, reading class. So the first two things, define the problem behavior, define the context or setting for it, and where it also doesn't occur. And be sure the FBA is conducted where the behavior does occur. Third, is the problem behavior related to a skill deficit? This is the third factor. It's very important. Is there evidence that a student does not know how to perform the skill and therefore cannot? If a student lacks a skill, a problem behavior is likely to help him or her escape or avoid the task. Let's go back to Tristan. We know that his problem behaviors, otherwise known as his target behavior, occurs in reading class. In my experience, the odds are 50-50 that Tristan's behavior is related to a skill deficit. Imagine being in a third grade reading class and the material that is being taught at the moment, you don't know it. It's beyond your capability at the moment. You're not able to read that material. Now, are you going to sit quietly in your seat and wait for the teacher to come and call on you and risk being made to look stupid in front of all of your friends and peers? Or are you, in order to protect yourself, more likely to start acting out in order what? In order to escape. The reality is many kids with skill deficits, they engage in problematic target behaviors in order to escape. They are not bad kids. They are merely trying to protect themselves from looking stupid in front of their peers. And it only takes 5 seconds of our lives to think back when we were children and what it would have been like for us to have that moment occur for us where we get called on, we can't read material in a class. Just imagine what that might have been like. So, kids with skill deficits oftentimes engage in what are known as problematic behaviors, i.e. behaviors that are a problem for an adult, and they can be a problem for other kids as well in learning, but they're engaging in those behaviors in order to escape, in order to protect themselves. And so what happens to these kids oftentimes that have skill deficits? They act out. Where do they go? They do go. They oftentimes get sent to timeout. Now, when that kid gets sent out of the room to timeout, that kid, he's been acting out in order to escape. Is timeout an escape for that kid? Absolutely. But here's the bigger problem with timeout. What happens to that kid down in timeout? Is he learning any additional reading comprehension? Is he acquiring any additional reading comprehension? No. He's falling farther and farther behind because he's not being taught while in timeout. So the more time that kid spends in timeout, the farther behind he falls, and the need to act out, what? Does it increase or decrease? His need to act out in reading class is increasing because of the use of timeout. He's falling farther and farther behind. His skill deficit is becoming greater and greater. Now as he goes back into the class each day, he's farther behind. His need to act out has only grown, not diminished. So you oftentimes hear, well, at the start of the school year, the kid was acting out, Jacob was acting out maybe once a week. Now he's acting out every day, he's going to timeout every day. Yeah, right. Absolutely. And people are sitting there saying, I can't figure him out. Now every day he acts out, he goes to timeout. Well, he's going to act out. He's fallen so far behind now, he's been going every day for the last 6 weeks. I've had teachers say that to me. He's been in timeout every day during reading for 6 weeks. Think how far behind he is now. The only thing that's going to change Jacob's behavior, if he's that kid that's been going to timeout for 6 weeks and missing 6 weeks of reading instruction, the only thing that's going to change his behavior is to be taught reading. Until he feels confident with the material and thus safe amongst his friends in that class, he is going to continue to act out in order to escape and avoid looking stupid. But ironically, in doing functional behavioral assessments, we rarely look to see whether or not a student's behavior is related to a skill deficit. Because regardless of what behavioral intervention you might come up with, any kid who's acting out due to a skill deficit is not going to change until that skill deficit is erased. Doesn't matter what the behavioral interventions are. That's what peer-reviewed research says. Until a kid erases his skill deficits, his behavior will not change. And yet, if we don't even look to see if a kid has a skill deficit, how are we ever going to address it and really change that kid's behavior? So again, the third component, number one, define the behavior in concrete terms. Number two, identify the context or setting. Number three, is it related to a skill deficit? Because if it is, you're going to have to remediate that deficit in order to change the kid's behavior. 4, is the problem related to a performance deficit? Once again, rarely looked at. And what is a performance deficit? Does the student have the skill, but for some reason not the desire to modify his or her behavior? This gets to the issue of, is the student bored? And kids who are bored often perceive no payoff in doing the work. Now, we know, we were students once. In everyone's school career, there were classes that each of us liked and classes that we did not like or we were bored with. Oftentimes for kids, in my experience, a lot of my friends did not like math. They were bored with math. They didn't like it. Do you think they did as well in math as they did in subjects they really liked and were interested in? No. They had performance deficits in math. And each of us knows, no matter where you are out here listening to this today, in your experience as a student, you also had performance deficits likely at some point. Even if you got all A's, you could have had performance deficits because you didn't work as hard or do as much as you did in classes that you were interested in. But the more common occurrence was your grades were less. They were worse than your grades in the courses that you were interested in because you had a performance deficit. So, how do we address performance deficits? For kids who have performance deficits, we need to figure out ways. One, do they have a performance deficit? They know the material, but they just won't perform. That's a performance deficit. How can we get these kids to perform so they're not acting out because they're bored? One of the things that we know from peer-reviewed research on kids with performance deficits is if we make them team leaders, like in math, if we make them the leader of a group with a math project or in reading, and they're the team leader, and they got to get everybody in their team to the same point in math or in reading, these kids do a lot better because now they're getting something that is important to them. And a trade-off for being bored. And in fact, it more than compensates for their boredom. And that is they get attention. They get recognition. They're the team leader. These kids know the material. They can help other kids learn the material, and now they will because they've been made a team leader. So if a kid has a performance deficit, we want to know it because there's another kid in the class who knows the materials who we can use as a teacher. We can use that kid to help other kids access and learn material as well. So we need to look at performance deficits. Okay, so now we've looked at and defined the problem behavior in concrete terms. We've identified the setting or the context of the behavior. We've identified whether the behavior is related to a skill or a performance deficit. We've done these things before we start the FBA. Now we can start the FBA. And here's what we do. The first component, and these are peer-reviewed research elements. You see at the top of the slide, PRR elements. That is the acronym for peer-reviewed research elements. Here's the first, indirect assessment. The first thing you do when you start the FBA is an indirect assessment. You interview the student, the student's parent, not always the teacher, but any germane teachers, and other pertinent adults at the school. When you go back to Trish, you're going to want to interview playground monitors. You don't really need to interview her teacher. Her behavior is on the playground. But with Tristan, because we've defined his behavior and we know it occurs in reading class, we're going to not only want to interview Tristan and his parents, we're going to want to interview the reading teacher, right? You want to always interview the student's parents, and other pertinent adults in the school. Oftentimes that can be teachers, like with Tristan, it's his reading teacher. Sometimes it's not, like with Trish. It's those adults working on the playground. So, indirect assessment. It's interviews. It's indirect. Second is direct assessment. This is a direct observation of the student in the context where the target/problem behavior is most likely to occur. Direct observations. So, in doing for Trish, we would observe her. The direct assessment would be done on the playground. For Tristan, it would be done in the reading class. And here's what you want to observe and develop. You want to develop a baseline. What is the frequency of the target behavior and the frequency of the desired behavior? If in reading class, Tristan talks out of turn 4 times every hour and only raises his hand once to be called on, which is the desired behavior. Don't talk out of turn. Raise your hand if you want to speak. If 4 out of 5 times he doesn't do that, then the baseline of his target behavior is 4. The baseline, which is 80%. 80%. Because the baseline is 4 out of 5 times. His replacement behavior is 1 out of 5 times. It's at 20%. His problem behavior occurs 80% of the time, and the desired behavior only occurs 20% of the time. The second thing we want to know, what are the antecedents to his behavior? When does he start talking out of turn? If we know it happens as soon as he comes into reading class, then we know it's something about reading class. Because if we know it's not happening in other classrooms, in the hallways and out on the playground, it's only happening in reading class, then the antecedent to that is coming into reading class triggers his behavior. We also want to know what has been the consequence for his behavior, because whatever it is, it's not been working. When we talked about Tristan, often kids who are in reading class having problems are sent to timeout. They keep falling farther and farther behind. Their need to act out increases. So if that was the case with Tristan, the consequence for his behavior was timeout. So now we know the baseline. Problem behavior occurs 80% of the time. His replacement, this is the term you'll hear, his desired behavior occurs only 20% of the time. What's the antecedent? Coming into reading class. What's the consequence? Timeout. These are things that we can observe. We're there, he comes in, he starts acting out. He does it 4 out of 5 times. He gets sent to timeout. We can observe these things. So that's what direct assessment is. It's the observational part of a functional behavioral assessment. The third part of an FBA is to review all of Tristan's record. School records, any relevant medical information, the school record should include any disciplinary information you want to review. Thoroughly review his school records, including his IEP, including any evaluations he's had, and any discipline information, as well as any other relevant medical information that is available. So that's the third component. Fourth, data analysis. At this point, you want to review the indirect assessment information from interviews, all the interview information, the direct observation, known as direct assessment information, and the information from the record reviews. So this is the fourth thing you do. You now, as a team, the FBA is conducted by the IEP team. You review, you compare and analyze the 3 other pieces of information: interviews, direct assessment observations, and the records. The IEP team conducting the FBA does that. And then fifth, you develop a hypothesis statement. This is your statement about what you believe to be the function, the why of the student's behavior. And it should be developed. The easiest way to develop a hypothesis statement. This is where you try to determine what the function or the why of the behavior is. What's driving the behavior? The easiest way to do it is to develop a 3-fold statement. And here's how it goes. When X occurs, student does Y in order to achieve Z. And Z is the behavior's function or purpose. So let's start with Tristan. When reading occurs, Tristan does Y. What does he do? He engages in numerous loud and irrelevant comments in order to achieve Z. It could be that we come to the conclusion he's doing it to escape because he has a skill deficit. Or we could say that when reading occurs, Tristan engages in numerous loud and irrelevant comments in order to achieve what? Maybe it's not to escape. Maybe he has a performance deficit. So he's bored and he's acting out. What is he looking for? Attention. He's trying to get something, not escape. He knows the material. He's now trying to get something. He's trying to get attention because he's bored. So this 3-fold statement will allow you to look at when something occurs, the student does this in order to achieve Z, and Z is the function or purpose. It's a very simple way to develop the hypothesis statement about what is the purpose. Is it to get something, escape or avoid something, or send a message? So the hypothesis statement is the 5th component of an FBA. You can do this. After you do the data analysis of all the interviews, the direct observation, and all the record reviews, you'll be in a position to say exactly When X occurs, the student does Y in order to achieve Z, the purpose or function, the Y. You'll be in a position to make a hypothesis about that. It will also predict, as I just noted, the general conditions under which the behavior is most and least likely to occur. And also the probable consequences that serve to maintain it. With Tristan, you know, the general conditions under which the behavior is most likely to occur is reading class. Least likely, everywhere else. The probable consequences, we know. The consequences have been in the past, timeout. We've already know that. So, the hypothesis. It is the team statement about the function of the student's behavior. Here is kind of a formula of how to come up with your hypothesis statement. This is critical. It gets to the why. And now finally, the sixth element is testing the hypothesis statement. You know, your hypothesis statement is an educated guess. Not an educated guess, it's an educated determination. But it may or may not be right. So you have to test the hypothesis statement. And you have to come up with a way to test it. It's not that difficult. If you suspect, let's go back to the hypothesis statement. When reading occurs, Tristan engages in loud and irrelevant comment numerous times during class in order, if you say, to escape. Then the way to test that is, if you think he's needing to escape because of a skill deficit, is you can test that hypothesis statement by having the teacher work with Tristan on reading material that is at a little bit lower level than that being taught to see if he has the skills at a lower level. If in fact he does, and then as the teacher works with him and is bumping up those skills, determines that he's not at the level where the current class is at, then you have proven that it is a skill deficit. He is able to read at a lower level, but not at the current level. So indeed, he is trying to escape because he's working at a frustrational level with the current material and the current pace of the class. So you've now proven it. If you think he's trying to get attention, you think it's a performance deficit, you would have the teacher sit with him and see whether or not he has the ability to perform the material. If he does, if he doesn't have any skill deficits, you know right away there's not a skill deficit involved. Is he simply bored? One of the ways now is, you know he has the skills. Make him a team leader. Just make him a team leader of the reading group. See if he acts out now, or if he's now suddenly engaged because he's leading a group and getting attention, which he was after in the first place when he was acting out. So one way to channel that need for attention is to put him in charge of a team. If you do that and he doesn't act out, you've now proven it was a performance deficit. That's a way to test your hypothesis. So again, what are the 6 components? Interviews, direct assessment, observation, record reviews, data analysis, where you review the 3 others, types of material, forming your hypothesis statement, and then testing it. Okay, here's the common issues that I have seen throughout my career, or at least the last 20 years, with functional behavioral assessments. Defining the behavior. The problem is that the student's target behavior is described in vague, not concrete terms. Jack's behavior is described as disrespectful. We really don't know what that means. It really tells us nothing. We want to know what is Jack's actual behavior. Disrespectful is not helpful. Second, the context or setting under which the target behavior is most and least likely to occur are not identified. All we get is Jack is disrespectful. We don't know what that means, what his behavior actually is, nor do we know what the context of it is. If all we hear is Jack is disrespectful, that sounds like it's in every class, in the hallways, in the cafeteria, and on the playground. Well, we know that's not true. Where is Jack disrespectful? That has to be identified in the functional behavioral assessment. Where is his behavior occurring and where is it not occurring? Skill deficits. Oftentimes FBAs, do not examine whether the student has a skill deficit. And the behavior is related to that. Also, performance deficits. I should have added another bullet here, right performance deficits. Oftentimes FBAs do not begin even when they start, they haven't even looked at whether or not the kid has a performance deficit. Very important. You got to look at both skill and performance deficits. Indirect assessments. Remember, one of the 6 components of the actual FBSA itself. Here's what you often see. There was no interview with the student or the parents. And people say, oh, we don't have to interview a 5-year-old. Really? You don't think a 5-year-old can tell you about his or her behavior? I sat in a meeting once about an FBA, and I asked the behavior specialist and the mother to go out and talk with the kid about his behavior, and to come back and tell us, a 5-year-old, the kid was 5, about what the kid had to say about his behavior. And you know what he said? He was angry that his father and his parents were no longer together. Now his father wasn't there when he woke up in the mornings. He was angry. And he felt bad. But he mostly felt angry that his father wasn't around. He knew it wasn't his mom's fault, but he was angry that his dad wasn't there. He was mad. He wanted his dad to be there, and he was mad every morning about that. You can be sure he was sad too, but that's how he described it. Now, was there value in interviewing that 5-year-old student? Yes. We learned a great deal. He's not a bad kid. He has a lot of anguish and pain due to his father no longer being in the household. But you know what? We would have only been guessing if we hadn't talked to him. The mother may well have known, but would not have put it perhaps in the exact terms that the kid did. So it is always important to interview a student. Now, if the kid's 3 years old, maybe not. But 5 and up, absolutely interview the student. The parent should always be interviewed. Oftentimes, I've seen it where it doesn't happen all the time. Too often it doesn't. By often, I mean 40% of the time in my career, parents aren't interviewed. Probably a third of the time, the student isn't interviewed about his or her concrete behavior. That's a problem at the school. You also see that other school personnel who have observed the problem behavior. Jack's target behavior is reported as occurring on the playground, yet playground monitors are not interviewed. So again, one of the things you look at in an FBA is under the indirect assessment, the interview. Was the student interviewed? Was the parent interviewed? And those adults at the school who have witnessed and observed the behavior. For Tristan, his behaviors in reading class, you don't want to interview his other teachers, you want to interview his reading teacher. For Trish, whose behavior was on the playground, you don't need to interview Trish's reading teacher, you need to interview the playground monitors. Oftentimes, not often, but I've seen it happen where those individuals are not interviewed. Direct assessment. There's no student observation. You cannot have a quality FBA without an observation of the student, or without an observation of the student in the correct setting. I've seen students, the observation is done in the wrong setting. As we mentioned with Jack, his behaviors problems are on the playground. His observation is in the classroom. That's the wrong setting. It's almost as bad as not doing an observation, doing one in the wrong setting. Another ongoing issue in FBAs, there's no baseline data collected regarding the frequency of the problem behavior and the frequency of the replacement behavior. So these are things to look for with an FBA. Data analysis. There's no baseline data available to review. Hypothesis statement. It does not state the function of the target behavior. You cannot have a hypothesis statement if it doesn't state what the team believes to be the function, the purpose, the why of the student's behavior. So you'll often see this because it does not articulate a threefold statement. The hypothesis statement is not done in this kind of formula or equation where when X occurs, the student does Y in order to achieve Z. This is the simplest and the clearest way to develop a hypothesis statement. And if it's not done, you can actually get so-called hypothesis statements that don't state the function of the target behavior. They just repeat what the behavior is. The purpose of the hypothesis statement is to determine the why of that concretely described behavior. Another problem you'll see is that the hypothesis statement is not tested. You know, it's an educated determination. It has to be tested. If not, it could well be wrong. So you have to test it for accuracy. It's absolutely essential that it be tested for accuracy. Okay? So that's the hypothesis statement. Now, who conducts the functional behavioral assessment? The student's IEP team and someone knowledgeable about the behavior. You should always have a social worker or a school psychologist involved in a functional behavioral assessment. Most of the behavioral information that needs to be collected, the observation, should be collected by a social worker or a school psychologist. Some of the interviewing, you know, some of the interviewing can be done by IEP team committee members, but if you can get the social worker or psychologist to do it, they understand behavior. The interviews are very important to developing the appropriate information about the behavior. So I would recommend that the social worker or school psychologist do the interviewing and the assessment. But the review of the records, the analysis of the records, the hypothesis statement, and the determination of how to test it can be done by the IEP team. And the IEP team, as I said, reviews all of the information, and they have to agree on the hypothesis statement and the testing of it as well. So that's what we know. Now, because I'm kind of running over, I've already gone a little bit more than an hour. I'm going to spend 10 minutes only. We've just covered how to get a functional behavioral assessment and one of the peer-reviewed research elements of functional behavioral assessments. Here's the peer-reviewed research elements of behavior intervention plans. So first, the person responsible for implementing the behavior intervention plan must be listed on the plan. Who's responsible for implementing it? Has to be on the plan. The baseline data from the FBA that we talked about the frequency of the target problem behavior and the frequency of the replacement desired behavior, it must be determined by the FBA and it must be built into the bid. We need to know where that kid is starting. With Tristan, we talked about 4 out of 5 times he's engaging in problematic behaviors. Only 1 out of 5 times is he raising his hand. The other 4 times he's talking out loud. So we need to know the baseline data for both the problem behavior and for the replacement desired behavior. And it has to be in the BIP. The timeline for assessing the faithful BIP implementation. You can have the best behavior intervention plan in the world, but if it's not implemented with fidelity in a faithful manner, it's just going to be words on paper. So one of the things that's required is you must include a timeline for monitoring whether the BIP is being implemented. And peer-reviewed research says when a behavior intervention plan is first developed, it needs to be monitored weekly to ensure it's being implemented. After 6 weeks, you can switch to bi-weekly monitoring to ensure it's being implemented. Behavior intervention plan is only as good as its implementation. So weekly to begin with, and then bi-weekly. And who's the person responsible for assessing this faithful implementation? That person has to be listed on the behavior intervention plan, and it cannot be the person who has a conflict of interest. If the teacher is responsible for implementing the plan, he or she cannot be responsible for monitoring whether they're faithfully implementing it. But you would be surprised how many times this situation arises. Well, the teacher's going to implement it, and she's going to also assess her faithful or his faithful implementation of it. No, 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 no. That is what is known as a pure conflict of interest. So, somebody's separate. What's the timeline for monitoring and evaluating whether there are changes in the student's target behaviors and replacement behaviors due to the implementation of the behavior intervention plan? So, you must include a timeline for collecting and analyzing behavioral progress data, or lack of behavioral progress data. And this should be done, in my view. You should be collecting this data every couple of weeks at the beginning. Then you can switch after about 3 months to every month you can be collecting the data, reviewing it. You need to be collecting it all along the way. But you should be collecting and reviewing it every couple of weeks. You want to check the faithful implementation every week. You want to check whether that implementation is resulting in behavioral changes every couple of weeks. Don't wait 9 weeks to see whether the behavior intervention plan is working. Collect the data and review it every couple of weeks for the first 3 months to be sure the plan is working, and if it is not, revise the plan. The behavior intervention plan should include the use of positive reinforcements for appropriate student behavior. This is PBIS. The law requires, as we talked about earlier, the use of PBIS. So, the behavior intervention plan needs to include a pattern of positive reinforcement. Why? Because PBIS is peer-reviewed, research-based. Now, how do we know what positive reinforcers under PBIS are going to work for a particular student? We need to get the student's input. Ray, what are effective positive reinforcers for that student? And in this instance, we need to do what's known as an interest inventory. So whenever you're working with an IEP team on doing a behavior intervention plan, you want to be sure an interest inventory is done for your son or daughter, so we can determine which positive reinforcers work for him or her. I've been to too many behavior intervention plan meetings where they give you a sheet with a checklist. And the committee sits around and says, okay, so which one of these positive reinforcers do we believe as adults will be effective? What? All you have to do is ask the student. Give the student, if you want to know what positive reinforcers work, we shouldn't be sitting around guessing. Let's hear what the student has to say. Give him or her an interest inventory. Here's the other thing. You have to vary reinforcers. You cannot have just one positive reinforcer. It's like getting ice cream every single day. You're going to get sick of it. So you have to include more than 1 or 2 positive reinforcers in a behavior intervention plan, because some positive reinforcers grow stale with constant use. And things that go stale, we don't like, whether we're a kid or an adult. So you need more than 1 or 2 positive reinforcers. This is probably the most important thing about an effective behavior intervention plan. We need to know, as I've said before, what is the target problem behavior rate and what is the replacement desired behavior frequency rate. And when you're developing a BIP and you want to say that a student's, many school districts will say we have a compliance, a desired, what's known as a replacement/desired compliance rate of 80% in this district. Every student's behavior has to be at 80% compliance minimum. Really? Well, think about this. Imposing an 80 to 100% replacement behavior rate immediately for a student. You write it in the behavior intervention plan. We have an 80% replacement behavior rate in this district that students must attain. So starting tomorrow, the kid has to be at 80%. If you put that in a kid's behavior intervention plan, and that kid is at a current replacement behavior rate of 25%, or like Tristan, his replacement desired behavior rate is 1 out of 5. He's at 20%. To say tomorrow he's going to be at 80% from now on, 4 out of 5 times he's going to raise his hand, and he's only going to talk out of turn 1 time starting tomorrow, when he's currently doing it 4 out of 5 times, that plan is completely unrealistic and will never work. And it is the reason that the vast majority of behavior intervention plans for students in this country do not work. Because the link between the kid's current replacement behavior rate, Tristan, 20%, and their rate that's required in the behavior intervention plan, 80%, is too great and thus too unrealistic. A kid can't go from 20% today to 80% tomorrow. But yet I see it all the time. I say, well, what's the kid's current replacement rate? He's at 15%. What does he have to be at tomorrow? 80%. Yeah, right. Like, that's going to happen. If a kid's like Tristan is at 20%, we want Tristan to succeed. We should not, as adults, be setting him up to fail by saying tomorrow you're at 80. What should we say? What should we be looking for Tristan under his behavior intervention plan to start, as far as a replacement / desired compliance rate? What should it be? Is that 20%? It should be at 30. Because then, if 1 out of 5 times he's engaging in the desired behavior, if we can get him to 1 out of 3 in the next 6 to 12 weeks, 1 out of 3, that's significant improvement. Significant improvement. It's more than he's gone from 20% to 33%. That's more than a 50% improvement. That's real success. And he will feel like he's succeeded if we make it a third. And then when he's at a third, we bump it up to 50%. And then we bump it up to 66%. But we do it in stages so he can improve his behavior gradually, which is how behavior is improved. It doesn't happen overnight. What happens overnight is kids see themselves failing every day and they think, why should I even bother? I quit. I'm not doing this. I'll never do that. That's what happens when we put 80% on kids who are at 20%. So a good behavior intervention plan draws a clear link between the current replacement behavior rate and what's required in the plan. If the current is 20, we shoot for 33. If the current is 33%, we shoot for 50. We don't shoot for 80 tomorrow. We shoot for trying to increase the kid's behavior to 50% over the next 6 weeks. Then after that, we move from 50 to 66%. This is very important. When you're in a meeting and a kid's at 20 or 25% or at a third and they say tomorrow it's 80%, that plan is inappropriate and there is no peer-reviewed research to support it. None. Zero. And yet it is the most common type of behavior intervention plan that is done. All this work is done in the FDA. All this work is done ensuring that all the right people's names are on the behavior intervention plan, that it's going to be reviewed for faithful implementation, it's going to be reviewed to see if the kid's behavior changes. But at the very end, we say, oh yeah, the compliance rate starting tomorrow for a kid at 20% is 80. Oh my God. We've just flushed it all away. And let me just, I think it's important to remind adults of this. We are going to finish with this. And this is very important. So this module is going to run a little longer than the other one that I did today. But this is important. Adults in the room who think this 80% is fair to kids should be reminded about the issue of New Year's resolutions. What's a New Year's resolution? It typically represents a behavior that an adult has identified that he or she needs to change. So these are behaviors that adults, the vast majority of whom do not have disabilities, they've identified a behavior about themselves that they need to change. Just like when they go to meetings to develop behavior intervention plans for kids, we talk about behaviors that kids have that they need to change. Well, let's see how good adults have been at changing their behaviors when they don't have a disability. Here's what we know about New Year's resolutions in America. Only 8 to 12% of adults are able to fulfill their New Year's resolutions. Only 8 to 12%. 88 to 92% of adults fail with their New Year's resolutions and thus are unable to change their behavior. They have identified a behavior that they need to change, and 9 out of 10 adults who make New Year's resolutions cannot do it. But they never have that context. They never think of what they're expecting of students in the context of, would it be fair to expect that of ourselves, and how have we done when we have? 90% of adults are unable to keep their New Year's resolutions, and consequently are unable to change their behaviors they've identified they need to. And get this, what percentage of adults quit on their New Year's resolutions after a month? This is a luxury kids don't have. They get a behavior intervention plan in September. They're expected to follow it till May. Now, adults set a New Year's resolution in January. What percentage of adults quit after 1 month on their New Year's resolutions? They just give up. 40%. 2 out of 5 adults, even after 1 month, walk away from trying to change their behavior. They give up. It's too hard for them to do. Yet we have kids on behavior intervention plans for 9 months at a time and then years. And yet 2 out of 5 adults can't stick with a New Year's resolution for more than a month. What percentage of adults have quit their New Year's resolutions after 3 months? 2/3. 2/3, 2 out of 3 adults walk away unable to change their behavior after 3 months. 3 months. What do you think if they were at 80% compliance every day, they'd be walking away from their New Year's resolutions? No. They're not anywhere near 80% compliance. That 40% of adults who quit after 1 month, their compliance rate is typically between 20 and 40%. So trying to change your behavior overnight and go from 20 or 40% compliance to every day I'm going to follow this diet, or every day I'm going to work out for an hour and a half, people can't do it. 40% quit after a month. 2 out of 3 adults stop after 3 months. So really, when you put it in that context, adults begin to understand, like, whoa, wait a minute, maybe 80% is way too high. Because 80% is something adults cannot achieve. They haven't been able to do it, and they do not have a disability. But they don't think about what they impose upon kids in the context of their own behavior, and would it be fair to them, and would it be attainable. And when you put New Year's resolutions on the table, it gives adults a whole new perspective on what reasonable expectations are for students with disabilities. And no different than students with disabilities. So if you're at 20%, 33% should be your goal over the next 6 weeks. The same should be for people with New Year's resolutions. What we know is, for people who succeed in their New Year's resolutions, they take small steps. They don't say, starting tomorrow, I haven't been working out in the past year, I'm going to work out 5 days a week. No. That's not going to happen. What they do say is, I'm going to start working out 2 days a week. 6 weeks from now, I'm going to go to 3 days a week. 3 months from now, I'm going to go to 4 days a week. 5 months from now, I'm going to go to 5 days a week. And they build up to that. People who say, oh, because we have this obsession in America with weight, I'm going to lose 40 pounds. 90% of those people do not make it. But people who say, I'm going to lose 3 pounds in the first 2 months. Then I'm going to lose 4 pounds in the 2 months after that. And then I might lose 5 pounds in 2 months after that. But don't have this 40 staring them in the face. Have the next 2 months, I'm going to lose 3 pounds. That's what they're focused on. 2 months after that, I'm going to lose 4 pounds. They're focused on 4, not 40. Which is overwhelming. 2 months after that, I'm going to lose 5 pounds. The likelihood of success for people who do it in increments, just like we're talking about for students, The likelihood of success grows exponentially when you do it in increments. So, there's something that we can learn from our own experiences of New Year's resolutions, the truths about that we can apply in being fair and equitable with students. So, remember it. Keep that in mind. Now, DIPs are developed by the student's IEP team. Thus, you're an active member in developing a behavior intervention plan. So you need to go back over all these peer-reviewed research elements and be sure that they are addressed. And then I never am involved in meetings. I'm never involved in meetings involving DIPs where I do not raise the issue of New Year's resolutions. And let me just say this. This is a final tip. You know, oftentimes when people talk about our kids, they talk about them as if their behaviors are really problematic, really dangerous. Oftentimes they describe the kids' behavior as dangerous. I've heard that term used so often. You know, it's not that kids don't engage in dangerous behavior. You bring a gun to school, that's dangerous behavior. There's no question about it. You beat a kid to a pulp, that's dangerous behavior. But much of what I hear to be dangerous behavior, once again in the eye of the beholder. I'm not saying it's not problematic behavior, but dangerous. Let's talk about what real dangerous behavior is. And I say this to adults in the room all the time. You want to categorize my client's behavior as dangerous. I don't think it's dangerous. But you know what? I do think many of you in this room have engaged in dangerous behavior, probably repeatedly over the last week. Now at this moment, most people in the room are like glaring at me like, what? And then I say, okay, how many of you have engaged in speeding while driving over the past week? Let's be honest here, raise your hand. How many of you have sped at least one time in the past week? How many of you, to be honest, let's just be honest, we're adults. We're the adults in the room. Let's be honest. How many of you have engaged in speeding in the past week more than 5 times? More than 10? How many of you engaged in speeding on the way to this meeting today? Usually if there's 10 people in the room, at least 2 people will admit it. It's more likely that 7 were involved in speeding on the way to the meeting. And then I say, let's talk about speeding. You want to talk about dangerous behavior, to put my client's behavior in context here today? Do you know how many people are killed in the United States due to people who speed? 16,000. Do you know how many people are injured in the United States due to people speeding? 16,000 people are killed every year in the United States due to people engaging in what we just said we do. And over 500,000 are injured. 500,000. By behavior that a number of us in this room have said we've engaged in repeatedly. Now, as we talk about my client's behavior and its so-called dangerousness, let's keep in mind what real dangerous behavior is. And use that to hopefully help guide us about how we look at my client's behavior. Because in the light of speeding, not so dangerous. And you think he's an outlier because my client engages in this behavior? I'm not saying it's not problematic. I acknowledge to you it is, but he's not an outlier. All of you. In fact, every single person in this room today has said they've engaged in dangerous behavior themselves. Consequences? Just think about that. We all need to have a context when we look at children, adolescents, and young adults who we have power over about their behavior. We need to look at it in the context of our own as well. So remember that. It's another valuable tip, particularly when someone describes the behavior of your son or daughter as dangerous when in fact it doesn't involve guns or serious bodily injury. So again, thank you very much. I know we ran a little bit late. Very hopeful that this material is helpful. And yes, I am presenting this in an advocating kind of way, and I want you to know that. I'm showing you ways to advocate using this material, and I hope it is helpful. My wife is a teacher. She's now an education administrator for a school district. There are tons and tons of great people in our schools, and I'm not trying to say there are not. I've met incredible teachers and administrators throughout my career. There are tons of great people. But the reality is there's not always tons of great practice. And one way to ensure great practice is to know it yourself. There is a lot of great practice out there, but you cannot guarantee it's going to happen every time you go into a meeting. So the more you know, the more effective you can be at ensuring that good practice occurs for your kids. So again, thank you very much.